All right, welcome into the HoosierIllustrated.com postgame wrap-up show. John Alden from In Touch with Indiana Sports with you. So is Kyler Staley of Talking About the Hoosiers, HoosierIllustrated.com, and many other things as well. But we're here to talk about Indiana's 42-13 victory over the Bruins to kick off Big Ten play, to really kind of get their season rolling in a way that I don't want to say many people didn't think was possible, but now that this result has happened, the door is open for this Indiana football team to potentially have one of the better seasons that they've had in the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, I think the excuses, the hesitations, whatever you have with this Indiana team, I think it kind of dies tonight. Indiana went in and honestly, I thought Indiana was going to win this game. I think a lot of people did. Obviously, they were favored. Vegas obviously thought that. The whole world that follows college football pretty much thought that. But the fact that they just went in there and just dominated, pretty much from start to finish, I mean, that's super impressive. So they've had 3 wins, and they've all been in dominant fashion.
Yeah, and I guess we can start with the offense and really Curtis Rourke specifically. I don't think we've seen a better game manager from an Indiana football standpoint since, I would say, Nate Sudfeld, and obviously those Kevin Wilson offenses in general. To see this Indiana Hoosier offense, again, from start to finish, just be in control of basically anytime they have the ball in their hands, they do almost whatever they want. And again, this UCLA team, when it comes down to it, they may not be one of the best or even one of the mid-tier teams when it comes to the Big Ten Conference. But for them to continue to execute the way they did at a higher level of competition than they have the past 2 weeks, it definitely shows that there's obviously buy-in. There's been a lot of development within the program. Obviously, you have a lot of continuity whenever it comes to the guys who, have known each other since the JMU days and that type of stuff. But to see everything gelling the way that it has, even though I would say we expected it to an extent, I don't think we expected it to look nearly as polished as it has through the first 3 games of the season.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely, I mean, the kind of thing that was said throughout the week. It's a business trip for Indiana, and that's exactly how they approached it. I think when they started that, and you talked about Curtis Rourke, so much swag, so much calmness in what Curtis Rourke's doing out there. I mean, he threw for over 300 yards? Is that correct?
Yeah, 307.
307.
4 touchdowns.
4 touchdowns. I mean, the thing is, too, it's like, yeah, the offensive line, there were some times where obviously it struggled a little bit at times, but when the pocket was collapsing, he wasn't panicking. He didn't feel like he was under pressure a whole lot. I mean, he was just sitting there, trusted his wide receivers, and obviously, we talked about it many times, the weapons that he has, with that wide receiver core, is just throwing them off, one by one. So obviously, having a quarterback like that's just experienced, high IQ quarterback, that doesn't fold under pressure is huge for these type of games like that. So obviously you don't really know what you're going to expect of the UCLA team, but to know that you have a quarterback who's kind of been through all of this, and that he knows, kind of what to expect to a certain extent, it's huge. And obviously, that was really big for Indiana tonight.
Obviously, a lot of work across the board from the wide receiver room tonight, but Miles Cross has himself a breakout game, 6 receptions, 90 yards, a touchdown, and he has yet another one-handed grab. This one a little less acrobatic. It almost looked like he did it on purpose, but a really good breakout game for him specifically, and it just goes to show that there is so much depth at this wide receiver room. Again, we didn't really see Donovan McCulley again tonight. I know he was off of the injury report for the first time since his injury, but we've gotten to the point now to where I'm comfortable saying, even though you love to have somebody like Donovan McCulley in the lineup for Indiana, you don't really need him as much as you used to. As we all know, last year he was a big part of the Indiana offense.
Yeah, and that's big for a lot of people, when it comes to this team. Like, it's big for Donovan McCulley, especially because he doesn't have all that pressure. He doesn't have all that weight to where he needs to be out on the field. He needs to be making plays. A lot of that pressure, takes off of him and whatnot. And it's just nice to know that, with a quarterback, Curtis Rourke, Signetti, those guys, whatever, they realize they don't have to force feed Donovan McCulley. They got so many weapons. Elijah Sarrett tonight was really, really spectacular. You talked about Miles Cross, Omar Cooper Jr. made some plays, as well. And then Keyshawn Williams as well, obviously with his 2 touchdowns. It's just guys, they pretty much come out of nowhere, honestly, on this wide receiver core. You kind of forget about him in a way because there's just so many weapons that they just come in. Keyshawn Williams, breaking out a little bit tonight as well. So it's just big, for all parties involved with that offense. Having a quarterback that's as, experienced, as that IQ, and then having, a talented wide receiver core. That's just a match made in heaven, honestly.
One thing we did see once again tonight, and if you watch the entirety of the game, and obviously the first half especially, you saw this as well, but Indiana is now 3 for 3 on being unable to close the second quarter for whatever reason. We saw it against FIU, saw it against Western Illinois, and then we saw it against UCLA. Really the only time in the entirety of the game that UCLA was able to put together a complete drive that was, I mean, not even really. It absolutely was the only time they got an actual touchdown because the other two scores they got were field goals. But it's just very interesting that the biggest hump, other than penalties, which we'll get to in a minute, for this Indiana team so far is being able to figure out how to close the first half.
Yeah, that's definitely, what do you want to call it, their biggest weakness right now, I guess you
And I hate to say over the hump. I know a lot of Mike Woodson
I didn't even catch
people
that.
who aren't
That's
fans
really
of him
good.
are going to notice that probably.
That's really good. But I guess you could just call it, I guess that's their biggest weakness, I guess. Obviously it hasn't been as big a deal, these first 3 games, but you're going to start getting into the bulk of your Big Ten play. That's something you've got to really fix because that's a very underrated section of the game, is closing out a half and building momentum going into the second half when it comes to, playing football and whatnot. So that's something that obviously got to fix. You could tell Cignetti, the halftime interviews and just, his post-game pressers and all that. That's something that's really bugging him right now. And you can't really pinpoint what the problem is of why they're letting their foot off the gas, but obviously it's something they really got to fix. Not a big deal right now. It's going to be a big deal if they do not get it fixed.
Tana says, I may have had a great googly moogly meltdown over a stretch of penalties against IU in the third quarter. Yeah, it was definitely a circus around the midway point of the third, whenever the game was still, I mean, Indiana had a comfortable 28-10 lead, but for some reason it felt like Indiana couldn't get out of their own ways. Obviously, you have 2 targeting penalties, and I know a lot of that can be very questionable. There were times where I wanted to kind of overreact in that sense, but at the same time, they still have to clean some things up. You don't just accidentally rack up 100 yards in penalties without realizing there's a little bit of a disciplinary issue. And maybe not in the sense that, I think most of it is they were just playing very aggressive, and maybe you had an officiating crew that didn't like some of the ways that Indiana was coming at the UCLA players, specifically from the defensive side of the ball. But at the same time, you do have to clean that up because that's not going to be the only time this season where you more than likely come across a crew that officiates the football game that way.
Yeah, that's definitely a big topic of conversation for sure coming out of this game. So obviously you go back, Cignetti, the big thing with him, when he was at JMU, he was one of the most less penalized teams, during his time there. And then obviously tonight just kind of came out of nowhere, just a little sloppy at times. Obviously the false starts, the holdings and whatnot, the targetings. That's going to be a big conversation going into this next week. Obviously that first one with CJ West was very, very controversial. Me personally, I just don't know what you can do in that situation when you've got a split second to make a decision on what you're doing.
And that's true.
And you've also got the quarterback obviously reaching for the ball and your head's just going at the exact same direction together. I just don't know what CJ West could have done. Yes, it's probably, technically that is the rule and whatnot, but honestly, that's not what targeting was meant to be.
And that's what I want to interrupt for you real quick. Whether or not it was targeting by definition, it's a shame that because there's no rule that talks about intentionality with the targeting, because I don't feel like he was doing that on purpose in any way, shape, or form. I wish there was a way you could extend it to where if he did it on purpose or not, that could maybe keep him from being thrown out of the game. Because be able to being removed from the game in its entirety for something you didn't mean to do feels like it's not fair to the player, of course.
Yeah, and obviously, I think you've got to look at that situation. When the college football season ends, and obviously, college football, all the higher ups up there are going to be put together, and they're going to be looking at this film. I hope this is one of the films that they look at, when it comes to, determining what exactly is targeting or whatnot, because it's just unfortunate. You took away one of Indiana's better defenders, one of their better pass rushers, just from an accident. That's all it was. And obviously, the UCLA quarterback, he was okay and everything, but there's just not a whole lot to what you can do. The other, D'Angelo Ponds targeting, yeah, that's probably targeting. And then obviously you've got the UCLA wide receiver. That was pretty controversial as well with that stuff. But
the only other truly controversial call that was not related to targeting was the roughing the passer whenever Ethan Garbers didn't even get the ball off. It looked like a true sack if you asked anybody else, it felt like.
Yep. I mean, and honestly, you go back to, football, 10 plus years ago or whatever. I mean, it's totally different. That's just the sack. But I get it. Obviously, you want to protect the quarterback in a lot of ways. You want to make the game safer because football, still to this day, even though a lot of rule changes has occurred, it's still a very violent sport in a lot of ways. So obviously you want to protect that. But going back to the CJ West thing, I think you've really got to look at that because that's not what targeting was meant to be. It's a complete accident. And it just needs to be reviewed, in my opinion.
Indiana Sports Connection asks, when was the last time they blew a team out like that? Well, obviously, if we're just talking teams in general, they've blown out everybody this season, but I couldn't tell you the last time that Indiana went into any sort of road environment, whether it be a Big Ten opponent or somebody they were playing in the non-conference, and took care of business from start to finish. Because this is the first time that I feel like Indiana fans can, like, the takeaway from the game can be that you have a team that is good, that knows they're good, and is going to play like they are better than their opposing, than the opponent on the other sideline, no matter who it is. And that's something that we may have seen a little bit of it during the best years of Tom Allen. That was obviously formed a little bit different than the way Cignetti has done things. But in terms of the overall confidence and I guess really the ability of this team in general, it's something that Indiana fans, and they haven't seen this before, I feel like.
No, and that's honestly a really, really good question because I was trying to think as you were talking, when was the last time they went on the road and obviously did something like this? But,
maybe a Purdue team in the past is all I can think of because, there's been plenty of bad Purdue teams over the years.
Yeah, it probably is. But just going back, let's just imagine, obviously, if this was still the Tom Allen era and everything. Obviously, I don't think it was going to be a blowout. Tom Allen had a real bad problem, times to watch him. There was times where Indiana obviously was the better team at times, but they would play down to the level of their opponent. UCLA is not going to be a good football team in the Big Ten. First-year head coach that just doesn't have any experience, and obviously it's just really tough in that situation. Cignetti kind of knew that. He was kind of, hunting for that in a lot of ways. So, but yeah, that's what you love about it because these players have taken the form of their head coach. Cignetti just instills confidence into anybody that talks to him, anybody that plays for him. That's just what they do. And like I said earlier, it's just they had that business trip mentality. And I think they're going to have that no matter who the opponent is. They're not going to back down. They have no reason to be scared. They really have nothing to lose in a lot of situations here. And this is a team that just wants to win and they play as a unit. There's a lot of good chemistry on this team, when it comes to the wide receiver cores, the running back cores, the O-line, the defense, all of that stuff. They all just play really, really well together. And that's what makes them a really, really fun team to watch.
I want to ask you, you made this comment on Twitter earlier, and I was 100% with you on it. And this isn't about the game itself, but the graphics that NBC put up of the Cignetti DJ, where they had different forms of him from the different places he's been a head coach. And they say he was playing the hits, I believe was the phrase that they use. And I think that's one of the best pieces of, I guess it was pregame production that I'd ever seen about any one individual. It was just very creative, and I enjoyed the way they put that together.
So NBC is they're very funny in that sense because obviously I don't know how much you watch like Sunday Night Football with the NFL and everything.
Probably not as much as you do.
So basically there's a lot of times that it's always a running joke of what the graphics are going to be. And they have a lot of weird graphics when it comes to this stuff. So NBC just likes to have fun in that situation. But that's just that's very funny. I don't know who came up with that. It's very random, and it was just kind of kind of a mind-blowing thing to see because I never would have thought I've seen Cignetti, behind a DJ booth. So that was
obviously there is a very large Indiana contingent, all things considered, when it comes to the amount of fans that made the trip out to the Rose Bowl. And now I think a topic of conversation moving forward, I feel like a lot of people are going to revisit the Indiana fans at home, because obviously they're going to play Charlotte next week in another non-conference matchup, their final non-conference matchup, and in a game that they should take care of business in once again. But one thing to keep an eye on is not necessarily will the stadium sell out. I'm not talking about that type of thing, but if Indiana is doing what Indiana has done all season long so far, and you see fans leaving at halftime again, I do think you're going to continue to see people get louder, with that conversation specifically on why people continue to not. I mean, I don't mean to jump too far ahead of myself or too far ahead of anything, the situation, I guess, but it's just something that I foresee being a topic of conversation when it comes down to next week.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about the beginning of the show a little bit, but I strongly feel the excuses and the hesitations of this team. Obviously, Indiana football has not been the best over the years, but that there's a new changing of the guard. It's a brand new era. It's the Kurt Cignetti era. A guy that wins, and it's time for the fans to kind of buy into that. Kind of buy into that mentality. Obviously, the Charlotte game is not a game that kind of helps in this situation, but you hope to see a lot more fans out there. You hope to see a lot more of them, stay through most of the game. And especially when they play Maryland, I think that's their next Big Ten home game after the Charlotte game. But, especially for that one, you start to see more fans, show out because those games are going to be really, really important. Obviously, if they can take care of business, versus Charlotte versus Maryland, and then on the road against Northwestern, which that game's still kind of tricky in a lot of ways. Then you get to homecoming weekend, and then you've got a ranked Nebraska team coming into town. So,
we keep talking about it each and every week, and each and every week we're getting closer and closer to that scenario that we talked about at the beginning of the season, before the season even started, of what if both teams are unbeaten, or at least both teams in the top 25 when they play each other, with it being homecoming, Hoosier Hysteria weekend. Again, it could be, not I want to say a nightmare scenario, maybe a nightmare for Nebraska, but the best environment that Memorial Stadium has seen potentially in years, if you can get to that point in the season, potentially unblemished.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously there's something that's kind of a stretch, but it can probably still be talked about just a little bit. It's a lot of time before that Nebraska game. Indiana continues to take care of business. I know they already got a vote in the AP. Who's to say that Indiana can't be one of the top 25 teams going into that game? Obviously you just take care of business. They don't have any ranked opponents or whatever, but you just never know what's going to happen, multiple weeks from now. So there's a lot of momentum with this Indiana team, a lot of momentum, and it's building nice. And it'll just be nice to see if the fans can kind of buy into that, get on that bandwagon while there's still room, and just see what they can really do, keep, Memorial Stadium a rocking environment. And that's just going to help them, moving forward.
The biggest thing you want to see next week, obviously, keep everybody healthy, get a big win, but also clean up the penalties, something we have not really seen them do, and then close out the second quarter. If you can finally, for once, figure out how to keep a team from scoring on their final drive of the second quarter, that's definitely a weird little monkey that Cignetti is trying ever so desperately to get off of his back. And again, next week will be another good opportunity to do that when the 49ers come to town.
Yes, sir. Exactly. Stay healthy, clean up those penalties. Hopefully you take care of business early so you can get those young guys in. You want to see Taven Jackson play a little bit more. You want to see those third, fourth unit guys get in there and whatnot. But stay healthy, take care of business. Don't let it be a let-up game, because it has all the makings of being a let-up game in a lot of ways. Don't let that happen. Take care of business, continue to move forward. And honestly, this Indiana team's, getting better and better as the week's going on. Just continue to do that, keep improving, and stay healthy. That's all I got to say.
With that being said, we'll go ahead and wrap up tonight's edition of the HoosierIllustrated.com post-game wrap-up show. Thanks to everybody in the YouTube chat who contributed and stayed up to watch this. And if you're watching this after the fact, we appreciate you as well. Obviously, check out In Touch with Indiana Sports on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Talking about the Hoosiers is now posting regularly on Thursdays, right, Kyler?
Yes, sir. Yeah, posting regularly on Thursdays, talking mostly football, but we've got also some really good basketball recruiting updates and all that stuff. But it'll continue to pick up once it's going to be crossover season soon. So yeah, definitely
That's
check
right.
that out.
And then obviously check out everything else going on at HoosierIllustrated.com with Alec, Kyler, Drew, Dylan. Great staff writing up a bunch of good things. We'll have the rest of the post game stuff coming up throughout the evening as well, and we'll be back. One of us, well, maybe both of us, I don't know for sure. We'll likely do another post game wrap up as often as we can. Hopefully, we'll be back here next Saturday to do it all again. And until then, till Monday, for me at least, this has been another episode of the HoosierIllustrated.com post-game wrap-up show.